Something that I've always found really interesting going into lots of different schools based on the facilitation that I've done in professional development is that nearly every school has a list of desired characteristics for their students, and nearly every single school lists respect as one of them. And I often think a lot about if they really truly mean respect, like mutual respect between adults and young people, or if by respect they really mean compliance. The students just fall in line, that they follow instructions without question, and if they push back or anything like that, then they're labeled as defiant or disobedient or rude or aggressive, particularly thinking about our Black students at school. As always, like keeping community building and relationships at the forefront of this work is going to be one of the most important things that you can do. In my experience as a classroom teacher, I've primarily worked in elementary grades, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And every year when we're talking about the way that we want our classroom to operate to benefit all students, all community members, a big part of that is also making sure that students know that they have the right to hold me accountable as their teacher. We read a book by Patricia Polacco called Thank You, Mr. Faulkner, and talk about the things that this teacher does to support Patricia as she's growing up and experiencing a lot of difficulty and like social challenges and learning challenges in school. And I have my students talk about what makes a good teacher, like what are the characteristics that they want in their teacher. And we draw up a contract. The students watch as I very seriously write this out and sign it, and we put it on our classroom wall. And if at any point in the year my students think that I'm violating something that I've promised them, something that I promised to be, or a way that I promised to support them, then they are more than free. I encourage them to come talk to me about it. I also really value student feedback. I think the first time I ever did a teacher evaluation was in college, but I think it's really important for incredibly young kids to know that their teachers technically work for them. And that's something that I've always told my students, like, yeah, the principal is technically my boss, but really I work for all of you. The number one way I've been able to center my students in my classroom is through inquiry-based teaching and facilitation. If we are doing a unit on race, the first thing I'm going to ask them is, what do you know about race? Or what do you know about racism? And we just chart and write down all things that students think they know about a particular topic. From these, I am able to identify different patterns and trends, but also misconceptions that should probably be corrected at some point, especially if students hold particularly negative biases towards certain people or groups of people. And from that, we come up with a list of questions. What are we curious about? What do we want to know? I'm really clear that there are no bad questions, that everyone's questions and curiosities are valid and welcomed. And based on those, we'll then locate different types of resources to begin to answer some of them and also chart our learning and understanding. As an instructor, I have to do a lot of background research into particular topics, but what we study and what we focus on in class is entirely driven by students' prior knowledge and understanding of a particular topic, the questions that they generate, and it's my job to help them locate resources and ask probing questions to help them deepen their understanding, and also for them to be able to express their understanding in a lot of different ways. So if I'm doing a unit or a lesson on race, that it's actually going to look different every single year, because every single year I have a different group of students with different types of background knowledge, and they all ask different types of questions too. I'll admit sometimes that can seem a little intimidating for teachers, but I think it's the most effective way to have an authentic learning experience for your kids and make sure that you are centering what they are the most interested in learning rather than just what you want to project onto them. One of the first things that I also do with my kids is introduce this notion of what does it mean for an idea to be socially constructed. And I will write out the words socially constructed, and we will talk about what each of those means. I want them to understand that concepts like race and gender are created by people for really specific reasons. And we know that these ideas are socially constructed and not based in biology because they have been changed and altered and manipulated throughout time and location. A huge misconception that I have to identify almost every single year is a lot of students, even young students, have been conditioned to believe that talking about anything related to race is inherently racist. So something that will often come up, like if we are, talking about like Martin Luther King Jr. for an example, and a student will say something like, and I'm not trying to be racist, but like he's a black man. And we'll stop for a second and I'll say, why do you think that is racist? And sometimes students are able to articulate their thoughts and sometimes not. And then we have a conversation about talking about somebody's race, especially if it's an important part of their identity, is not racist. It's not negative, it's not insulting, it's the way that we talk about people that's important. So if I'm Asian American, if I'm Korean American, and you were trying to describe me to another person, you said, oh yes, like my teacher, she's Korean American, she's Asian. I don't have a problem with that because I'm actually really proud to be Asian. I'm really proud to be Korean American. But if you use those identifiers to insult me, to stereotype me, to put me down in some way, that's when it becomes not okay. That's when it becomes racist. And so I think it's really important to make that distinction and to show that, you know, it's not racist to talk about race. And just because you're talking about somebody's racialized identity doesn't always mean that you're oppressing them or putting them down or talking about them in a negative way. I've had a student ask if every single president in the United States is racist or has been a racist. And thinking, wow, that is an enormous question. And again, wanting to avoid centering my own perspective and bias and use this as a learning opportunity for my kids. Oftentimes, I will deflect a little, but in like an intentional way, and ask my students, you know, that's really interesting. I'm curious to know what you think, or open up to the rest of the class. What do you all think and why? And we'll write down a lot of my kids' observations and opinions. From there, I remember asking them, are there particular presidents that you're curious about? I look at presidents like FDR as actually a really good example of that, a president who is widely known and beloved by liberals for creating different like social networks and safety systems for people. And at the same time, while yes, there were many programs during his administration that helps people who are struggling, he's also responsible for the internment of thousands of Japanese American citizens put into camps, belongings removed, property lost, incarcerated for no other reason than looking like a country that we were fighting across the ocean. And so presenting all of that information to kids and asking, well, what do you think? And having a discussion based on that. But again, I try to be really mindful and really careful about centering my own opinions, like no matter what they might be, and always, you know, trying to center students by asking them their opinions, what they think, what their observations are, and having them justify their thinking. It's so important for kids to recognize like the gray area in a lot of different situations, and to try to move away from binary thinking as much as possible. And also to move away from terms like that are really based in judgment, like this is good or bad, like what does that even mean? But to recognize that people are complicated and nuanced, and situations can be complicated and nuanced, some more than others, obviously. Like racism is always bad and enslavement is always bad, but that it's so important to hold space for multiple truths at the same time. I know a lot of teachers have anxiety that they're going to be accused of standing on their soapbox and projecting their own political agendas onto students. They can be accused of brainwashing and indoctrinating just because you want to talk about things like, you know, racial and gender identity in class. I find that inquiry-based instruction kind of takes away that stress because you're responding to students' curiosity. Inquiry-based learning and teaching is for anyone of any grade. I cannot imagine a 7-year-old or a 15-year-old who would not be more excited about being able to guide their own learning and understanding than just doing what the teacher is telling you to do. I think also when you're communicating what you're doing in your classroom with your school leadership or with families and caregivers in your class, it's really important and really powerful to be able to say, this is the umbrella topic of what we're studying, and these are the questions that your students came up with, and this is how we're seeking to answer those questions. It's not about teaching kids like what to think, it's training them how to think. We can't expect our kids to just suddenly like wake up 18 being able to vote and understand how our country works, how voting works, how systems of power and oppression have operated as long as, you know, people have been around. These conversations have to start somewhere. So I think now is as good a time as ever, no matter what age you teach.